Hello and welcome to the Sight and Sound Video History Series of the Toledo Lucas County Public Library. I'm Tom Walton. One of the inescapable realities of World War II is that one day soon, perhaps in the not too distant future, we will lose our last remaining World War II vet, our last eyewitness to that awful chapter in American history. How fortunate that today our guest is capturing that history before it's gone forever and it's too late. Our guest is Andrew Bud Fisher, and he's the author of this book, What a Time It Was, Interviews with Northwest Ohio Veterans of World War II. And Mr. Fisher, Bud, if I may, it's a delight to have you with us today. Your book and these interviews are part of the Library of Congress Veterans History Project, and I believe is the largest of its kind in the United States, is it not?
There are, you mean our part of it? Yes. We've done 800 interviews in Northwest Ohio, and I think we are probably the largest contributor to the Library of Congress, where they have 100,000 interviews, but I haven't asked them.
How did the national project, of which you're a part, get started?
The Congress of the United States decided that maybe we ought to remember those people that did the work. You know, in past wars, we knew all about the admirals and the colonels and the generals, and we knew Patton and we knew Nimitz, but we never knew the guy who was in the foxhole. And so they decided that there would be an archive devoted to those people. And so they went out to all 50 states and appointed or got coordinators, and those coordinators, which in Toledo was the University of Toledo, found volunteers. In Toledo, it's Dr. Tom Barden, who has since retired. It's now the Kennedy Center at the university. And so we started out very slowly, but then we gathered speed, and it has turned out to be so far 800 interviews.
Wow, and so there are people all over the country who do what you do.
Yes.
Perhaps not to the scale or level that you have done it, but all over the country, these interviews are being conducted and preserved.
Yes, the problem is that it's so time-consuming.
Right.
I retired many years ago, so I have plenty of time. And one of the articles in the Blade, I admit that I'm a terrible golfer, so I wasn't going to spend my retirement years playing golf. And so I worked at it for 15 years.
So golf's loss is history's gain, we could say. So there are other areas in Ohio where people just like yourself are doing these kinds of interviews, Columbus, Cincinnati, Cleveland?
Yes, I think so. And I have recently talked to someone in Cincinnati, so I think they're doing the same thing. I don't know to what extent they're doing it.
Now, apart from the fact that you considered yourself a terrible golfer, there must have been other inspirations. What motivated you to get involved in the first place?
Well, one of the things was that I was in the Army, and I did absolutely nothing. Well, and while everyone was going to Korea and putting life and limb at risk, I went to Austria. Austria is the country club of the U.S. Army. I did nothing, traveled around Europe. I didn't contribute at all to my country, I didn't think. So when this thing came along, I thought, maybe I could finally do something worthwhile. And so I began the Veterans History Project. And I think I've now contributed at least as much as I would have in the service.
Well, consider this, Austria remains free to this day thanks to your service. How many World War II veterans remain? Do we know a number?
Always in seeking those numbers, you get different answers. My guess is that there are about 1 million left. Okay. There were 15 to 18 million in the beginning, and now we're down to about 1 million. It might be interesting to note that I interviewed the last World War I veteran in Ohio, who was one of the last two in the United States. A man named Russell Coffey, who was in a nursing home in North Baltimore. And I was fortunate enough to get down there to talk to Mr. Coffey.
How old was he?
He was 106 at the time we did the interview.
And his memory was still sound?
And it was a strange interview. I would ask questions, and his caregiver would shout the questions into his ear, and he would give an answer. The important thing was that we had his voice, we had a few of his thoughts, but we had a World War I veteran who was remembered.
Yeah. So if we have roughly 1 million or so remaining, I read somewhere, I saw a comment online from the director of a World War II museum in New Orleans, who said our World War II vets are passing away at the rate of about 1,100 a day, and that they'll be gone by 2020. Does that sound about right to you?
Oh, yes. If you were in the service as late as 1945, you were probably 18, so you were born in 27. So today you would be 90. So that's quite old.
And of course, the pace of the loss is picking up as they age. In the beginning, we weren't losing 1,100 a day, nowhere near it, but now we are.
When we began this project in 2002, we talked mostly to World War II veterans. And there seemed to be lots of them, and we were very busy. And then that tapered off, and today the Korean War veterans are the old folks. Probably a poor choice of words.
Well, are there any World War II veterans remaining in Northwest Ohio who you haven't spoken to?
Yes. There was an article in the Toledo Blade with a picture, you may have seen it, of me interviewing someone and my associate George Pugh doing the video, and that caused the phone to ring. And the World War II veterans respond to things in the Blade. So we're hoping that whatever we do in the future will show up in the Blade. And there are still some left who are willing to be interviewed if we can just coax them.
Did you find them generally eager to talk?
Once they got into it, we found that, strangely enough, it's daughters that encourage their fathers to participate. And once they get into it, yes, they remember the most amazing things. You know, of course, everybody knows their serial number, but they knew their unit numbers, and they knew the guy next to them, you know, and it was a treat.
Yeah. Some of them were persuaded by their daughters, even grandchildren.
Oh, yes.
Did you employ grandchildren as a bit of a tool to
If we had the chance, yes.
You were not above that.
Oh, yes. We were not above getting the children involved to get father or grandfather to speak.
You touched on something I find interesting, and that is, because I can relate. My own father served in World War II, Battle of Ardennes, Battle of the Bulge.
Oh, yes.
He never, and I mean never, talked about it.
Yes.
He would, no matter how much we pleaded with him,
Yes.
I wanted to know. I don't want to talk about it, and I won't.
Yes.
I know he saw some horrible things.
Oh, yes.
He was in foxholes with buddies. He never forgot, but he just wouldn't talk about it. And now he's gone.
Yes.
So did you find that some veterans, like my dad, were reluctant, even after you got into it? They said, you know, that's personal, I just can't go there.
One fellow said to me when I asked him to participate, he said, I spent years in analysis trying to forget this, and now you want me to bring it back. But mainly, I think they want to talk about it. They want to remember those times. They want to remember maybe their lost youth. Once they get into it, then it's easy for them.
getting them to sit down and
Oh, yes, that's
open
the
up
part.
is the
That's
hard
the
part.
hard
Yeah.
part, yes.
Now, we're talking about men generally, but there were a number of women. In reading your book, I noticed that you sat down and interviewed. They may not have been allowed to be in combat, but they had an extremely vital role, and many of them were in harm's way, just like the men.
Yeah, some of my favorite subjects were Army nurses. Mm-hmm. Now, they didn't have to be there. Any woman that was in the service was a volunteer. One of my top 2 or 3 or 4 interviews is an Army nurse who lived in Rossford and went to Africa and Italy. They participated when they didn't have to. They should have been home doing what young women do, going to college or whatever.
Well, there was this Rosie the Riveter attitude that we're all one country, and so the women were eager to help in any way they could.
Yes, and we wanted to be sure that our book included Rosie the Riveter, and we did. We found them and we included them. We tried to in the first book, What a Time It Was, to include everyone that had any part of World War II. We wanted to have all the services. We wanted to have men and women. We wanted to have Rosie the Riveter. We wanted to have nurses, wax and waves, whoever we could get, so that the book covered most everyone.
Yeah, a lot of folks, perhaps younger people watching our conversation, may not realize that back in those days, young men did not have the option. Many were drafted into the service and went proudly to serve their country. But as you point out, the women had to step up and volunteer.
Yes, yes. Yeah. And they did a marvelous job. And Toledo was very active. That is, Rosie the Riveter in Toledo was very active. And those ladies would drive up to the Willow Run bomber plant. Mm-hmm. You know, they would share rides up there and work in the bomber plant all day. And they worked at Jeep. It was not called Jeep at the time. And so they contributed greatly.
Now, you say you interviewed people who had, no matter how peripheral a connection to the war, did you find people who, like yourself, feel wrongly, by the way, that you didn't contribute? Obviously you did. But they felt a little guilty that they didn't see combat.
Oh, yes. And those people didn't want to be interviewed.
Really?
They said, we didn't do anything. Well, I could relate to that. But when you're in the service, you do what you're told to do, and you go where you're told to go. So you don't choose where you're going to go or what you're going to do. And the Veterans History Project was designed to talk to everyone who served their country, no matter where or when.
Mm-hmm. Talk about your interview format. Was it just Q&A, or did you simply turn on the recorder and listen?
Well, no, I would ask questions as you are asking. I would ask them first to talk about their life before the service. Where did they go to school? And then how did they get in the service? in the service. What was basic training or boot camp like? And where did you go after? And what was it like to be on a troop ship going across the ocean? And where did you serve? And
of course, those were what we might call softball questions
yes.
to loosen up the subject
yes.
and say, well, they get comfortable talking about that. Now we'll get into the more painful memories.
Yes, yes. And we did get into a lot of emotion. And it was not unusual. So what we would do is just have a moment when we didn't ask questions, or we just let that emotion come and go. And as they remembered their friends that never came back, and so on.
Were all of these interviews recorded visually or just with a tape recorder?
When we began, we did tape recordings, and they were doing tape recordings all over the nation. Then the Library of Congress and we here in Toledo went to DVDs. Now the DVDs that we're doing are just wonderful, and they are such an important part of family genealogy that we make sure that each family gets copies. So a copy goes to the Library of Congress, to the University of Toledo, and to the family.
And doing them on DVDs, I would imagine you also got to include photos of them as they looked during the service?
Yes.
If they still had them?
I work with a fellow named George Pugh, and George does the videography, which I know nothing about. But he also does stills. He asks people to bring along photos of them in the service and whatever. And then he includes those in the DVD. So it's a wonderful keepsake.
Now, were your interviews mostly one-on-one, or did sometimes family members sit in?
There were times when I invited the wife or the children sitting there to contribute. Now, if your father or your husband forgot anything, feel free to bring it up. Early on in this program, I went to the veterans' home in Sandusky, and I talked to 9 people at one time. You know, there was a set question, and what did the 9 people have to say about that, because they were all different services, different wars. Mm-hmm. That was interesting.
Yeah.
But no, these were very informal, and oftentimes the wife wanted to contribute when the husband forgot.
Well, conversely, I would imagine there were times when the wife was hearing something she didn't know.
Oh, yeah.
Did that happen?
Oh, often, very often. Why, I never knew that.
Something he had kept
yes.
in his heart,
oh, yeah.
not shared.
Yeah, sometimes this was the first time the family heard about his service.
Wow.
So we provided the platform.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, how I wish you had talked to my dad.
Yeah.
You say you've done more than 800 of these World War II veteran interviews now. Your book, which we talked about at the beginning, I think about 80 or so
80,
made the book.
Yes.
How did they make the cut? How did you decide who's in the book?
I have no idea.
Were they the first 80?
No. I tried to divide the book into different services, different people, nurses, medics, Marines.
Now, this was before there was an Air Force, right? We had the Army Air Corps in the book?
I never did understand that when the Army Air Corps became the U.S. Air Force or the Army Air Force.
But I noticed several of your subjects are Army Air Corps pilots.
Yes. That was early on in World War II.
Yeah. Now, there must have been a few of these veterans whose stories to this day stand out for you.
Yes.
Can you recall a couple of them for us?
Yes, my favorite interview was of a man who was a medic. And it's my favorite because he was in a hospital, working in a hospital in England, which meant that every day he worked in a warm building and had a warm meal every day and slept in a warm bed. And there were volunteers there was a call for volunteers for medics to go to the continent to work with platoons or battalions. He left this nice warm spot in England and he went to work with a platoon as a medic. Now, what he would do is follow the troops, and as they needed help, he was right there. One morning, they were jumping off on the offensive into a forest. As they went into the forest, there were suddenly all these explosions. Well, it turned out the forest was mined. And he was scared stiff, he said. But he had to go in there and get those people out. 6 times he went into the woods, to the forest. 6 times he picked up wounded men, and 6 times he took them out. But each step he took could have been on a mine. He could have been killed too. So he carried these people out 6 times, and he said when it was all done, he started shaking, and he couldn't, he thought he would shake apart. And he got the Bronze Star for that. And I said, that sounds like a Silver Star to me. And he said, I wasn't thinking about medals. I was thinking, God help me get these people out of here. And that was, I thought, the most wonderful interview.
Yeah, my first reaction is Bronze Star is not enough.
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
That's what I thought.
Wow, what an amazing story. And of course, medics wore American Cross, Red Cross armbands, sort of set them apart. And the whole point was they didn't carry weapons, and so therefore leave them alone, let them treat the wounded. But they're still in harm's way, and
Oh, yes.
you're going to trust the enemy to leave the guy in the armband alone? I don't know.
Well, would you like to hear another one?
Absolutely.
This was also a medic. He was from Perrysburg.
I think I know the gentleman's name, David Fought.
Oh, do you? Wonderful. Yes. David Fought was a medic who went in on D-Day. And as he went in, there were people laying on the beach, and he wanted to stop and take care of them. And his sergeant said, no, we have to go on because we have to be at a certain place to take care of another unit. Well, when they got into France, into the bocage, they were fighting. There was a lot of crossfire. When the crossfire would stop, he had a Jeep, and he would drive into no man's land with his flag flying. If there was a burst of fire in front of him, he knew he shouldn't go. If they let him come in, he would go in and he would tend to the wounded, Americans or Germans. And he took his life in his hands every time he did that. Well, I thought that was a wonderful thing, and the most wonderful part about it was he said in the end, when I got off the bus in Perrysburg and I saw downtown Perrysburg, he said, I thought I was a tough soldier, but I started crying, and I cried all the way home. I thought that was a wonderful story.
This is after he got out of the service.
Yes,
he came home.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, there was another amazing story that captivated me when I read it, and that was talking about the Army Air Corps, and this was a pilot named William Proventia. His plane was shot down over Germany.
Yes.
And he ended up a prisoner of war for like a year. He describes how he and a few others escaped later from the German captors. Do you remember his story? Can you talk about Mr. Proventia?
That's not one that I looked up recently, but I remember he's from southeast Michigan. He spent a year in a prison camp, and I think they marched him out of the prison camp. And when they marched the American prisoners, they were sending them west. And the idea was to get them away from the Russians. But I think the other part of the idea was so that the guards who were guarding the prisoners could also go west to be with the Americans. Yes. Yes, and I remember talking to William Proventia. That's been 10 years ago at least.
Well, the one I especially want to ask you about, well, I've got a couple more too, but I was struck by the name of this soldier named Jack Spratt. He described for you a miracle parachute jump. And I don't know if you're remembering that.
The parachute didn't open.
Didn't open. And he jumped out of the plane at 500 feet.
Yes.
And fortunately landed in a tree rather than hitting the ground with just that little pilot chute
right.
to break the fall. I remember that one?
Yes.
But I was struck by Jack Spratt.
Yes, we remember that name.
Yeah, you do. Yeah. You remember his story?
Oh, yes. He jumped out, landed in the tree, and he was in And then sort of a no man's land, Patton was close by. And he eventually linked up with Patton. And of course, he was saved from the Germans who were not far away. And he went back there many years later to visit that family who shielded him after he landed in the tree. Yes, I remember that one.
Yeah. You talked briefly about the nurses, the women who had stepped forward and put themselves available for service. And I read about one, Elizabeth Dunapace. Do you remember her name? She talked of the horror of treating so many wounded and dying, and she was at a military hospital somewhere in the Pacific.
Yes.
Do you remember her story?
Yes, she worked on an island. I've forgotten the name of the island at the moment, but they were so overcrowded. They had the wounded on cots, laying on the floor, laying on the ground outside of the tent, and those nurses worked almost around the clock. And they kept coming. The wounded just kept coming. And of course, as I said earlier, she didn't have to be there. Yeah. But there were all of these wonderful nurses who were serving their country.
You said something a moment ago that was interesting about how the medics and these nurses would end up, especially in the medics' case, treating the enemy.
Yes. Yeah.
I don't think a lot of people realize that armband meant if there's somebody out there wounded, you'd try to help them. And if the enemy understood that, they would let you do that. I don't think people realize that.
In the case of David Fote, sometimes, and I don't know how many times, the Germans would call him into their lines because they didn't have medics. If you were wounded, if you were a German soldier wounded, so he would go into the German lines and help them treat their wounded. Then they would let him go and back to the American
Isn't that one
lines.
of the great ironies of World War II, of war in general? We'll stop fighting for a second so you can help this guy.
Yeah. There was still some humanity in Europe, even beyond the Geneva Conventions, but not so in the Pacific.
Mm-hmm. The Japanese perhaps not as tolerant of those understood rules.
The Japanese felt that it was, I guess, beneath your dignity to surrender. And so they didn't treat American prisoners well or American wounded well. Mm-hmm. It's their culture.
That speaks to the American culture, I think, that we would have treated their soldiers and did.
Yes. And it may have been Dunapace that treated some Japanese, and the Japanese were not very grateful for being treated by American nurses. Yeah, that's just, as I said, their culture.
In the service of the emperor.
Yes.
Accept your fate.
Yeah,
in other words. Yeah. Another of your interviews, and I know that you would single this one out, was a Tuskegee Airman, and a gentleman up in southeast Michigan.
Yes.
Can you talk about that one and perhaps explain again for younger viewers who the Tuskegee Airmen were?
Well, the Tuskegee Airmen were a group of black pilots. This was before the Army was integrated, or the services were integrated. And so they did their training in Tuskegee, Alabama. And they became pilots, and they went to Europe, to Italy. And their job was to escort American bombers who were flying out of Italy into Austria, Germany, Hungary. I couldn't find a Tuskegee Airman, a flyer in Toledo, but I heard about this man in Southfield, Michigan, So I called him up, and oh yes, he'd talk to me. And so I went up to Southfield and talked to Washington Ross.
Washington Ross.
And Washington Ross was a colonel, and he looked every bit a colonel. And he told me about flying P-51s. P-51 was, for people that don't know, the hottest airplane in World War II. And the Tuskegee Airmen flew the P-51s. They were called red tails. They were marked with red tails. And so we talked about his service in Italy. We talked about how they got along in Tuskegee, Alabama. And then, of course, we got into the racial thing, which I thought was important to talk about.
Well, they were facing two enemies.
Yes.
The Germans and discrimination within their own
because at that time,
service.
right, they were separate. Now, why they had to be separate, I think it was Harry Truman didn't understand that. So he said, let's all get together. And I remember when our unit was integrated, we didn't care. You know, as long as you're willing to do what you're supposed to be doing, we don't care who you are.
Yeah, and of course they served with great valor.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Oh, yes. The Tuskegee Airmen, I think I know what I'm saying, did not ever lose a bomber that they were escorting. Yes, they conducted themselves with great honor.
Mm-hmm. And I think those few who are left still get together, don't they?
Yes.
Have reunions. And
I was up in Detroit, I don't know, a year or so ago, and I found the Tuskegee Airmen's Museum at the old Fort Wayne on the west side of Detroit. And I went in there and met some of the people, the fellow that runs the place, and the Tuskegee Airmen say that the association began there in Detroit at Fort Wayne. Mm-hmm. And so I visited with them and spent some time in their museum. Yeah. Mm-hmm. They're a very proud group of men.
Oh, absolutely. Tom Brokaw, I think, was called these men, not just the Tuskegee Airmen, but everyone who served our greatest generation. Do you agree with that?
Yes. Oh, yes.
Why?
Well, because they didn't have to be herded into the service. They wanted to serve their country. And they were not professional soldiers. You know, American soldiers were kids that were going to college or working at a job somewhere, and they were fighting two enemies who were professional. And they were willing to go. They made great sacrifices. And I thought that they had earned the title of the greatest generation.
I don't know that there's been, of course, we have an all-volunteer military today in 2017, but I don't know that there's ever been that same passion of patriotism and obligation to go and do what you can that we saw at the outbreak of World War II.
Yes, I've said that many times, that maybe we used it all up in World War II, because when Korea came, there was less. When Vietnam came, there was still less. Patriotism. The civilians didn't get behind those two wars.
Well, in the case of World War II, our country had been attacked.
Yes.
And provoked that perhaps more than we would see later with these other conflicts where we went somewhere and engaged. We were the victims at the outset.
That's a very good point, yes. Well, the book that I wrote called What a Time It Was is meant to describe those people that lived through the Great Depression, tough kids who then became tough soldiers. And I thought that there was quite a relationship between the Great Depression and the people that fought our war.
Now, we talked about Tuskegee reunions. I would imagine all World War II veterans reunions are dwindling.
Yes.
The turnout is poor.
Yes.
They lose more and more each year. Are they still held?
From the people I've talked to, there are fewer with fewer people, and one day they will probably cease to exist.
Yeah, and here we are in 2017, and the best guess is that by 2020 we will have none of them left.
Yeah.
So what a loss that will be.
Yes.
Can you talk about some of the hardships that were described to you in these interviews of battle? Because again, I'm trying to keep in mind younger people who have no appreciation for what those men went through in the foxholes. They may not even know what a foxhole is. But the frostbite, fighting out of a hole in the ground with water, what did they talk to you about some of those hardships? What did they say?
Maybe the greatest hardships were in Korea. As the U.S. military moved north up toward the Yalu River, the Chinese border, and there was a place called the Chosan Reservoir. And there they got into terrible weather, and thus the name of the book, 30 Below on Christmas Eve.
This is your other book, 30 Below on Christmas Eve. Nothing better summarizes hardship than that.
Yes, and there was more loss, probably more casualties to weather than to the North Koreans or the Chinese. Mm-hmm. So they went through a terrible time without the proper uniforms, without the proper boots, a lot of frostbite, a lot of people that gave up. There's one interview in there where the Marine describes Marines laying on the side of the road who won't get up. They're just used up. And they're told, if you don't get up, they're going to capture you and you'll be in prison. It didn't matter. They had used up whatever reservoirs of strength they had.
Wow.
So Korea was worse, I think, than Germany.
And again, there was no national spirit of unity or passion behind that war.
Yes, that's right.
That we saw in World War II.
Yeah,
so
right.
they had that burden as well. I was struck in both books that people, some of these military folks, acknowledged how terribly frightened they were, how scared they were. And I think this gets back to your point about they were amateurs fighting professionals.
Yes.
And any day could be their last. It would be natural to be so frightened, wouldn't it? And yet we somehow think of our soldiers as above fear. But fear is what kept a lot of them alive.
I don't think that the people you see as heroes knew they were going to be heroes 5 seconds ago. You know, a hero, a heroic action is something that comes upon you, but until that happens, you're scared.
You don't seek out heroism, it finds you.
No, very good. It finds
battle.
you, yes.
Yeah. So I can imagine these folks getting emotional about telling
yes.
you their stories, and maybe needed a break for a moment or something to compose themselves. Yeah.
Yes, there was a lot of that in the World War II interviews.
Yeah.
But it was never mentioned. We didn't say anything about it. They didn't say anything, and then we went on. Mm-hmm. It was a natural reaction.
Now, we hear about, and this gets back to World War II again, veterans who were so eager to serve their country after Pearl Harbor that they lied about their age to get into service before they were technically or legally permitted to do so. Did you talk to some of those? They were kids. They might have been 17, 16 in some cases.
I may have talked to someone, I don't remember, I think he was about 15. Of course, a big kid for his age, probably a big kid off the farm. But he lied about his age. Now, what would happen if you were less than 18 as your mother or father had to sign for you? If they wouldn't sign for you, then you lied about it. So there was some of that, yes. They were eager to get into the action.
I would have had a hard time signing for my 15-year-old son to go off to World War II.
Well, sure.
But then again, I didn't live through that feeling of national passion about it. Are your interviews ongoing as we speak today in 2017, or is the project pretty much finished?
Oh, no, as late as yesterday.
You had one yesterday?
Yes. We have a, George Pugh, who I mentioned, who does the videos, took his shop there in White House and turned part of it into a studio. And so we often go to his studio where he has a, what is it called, a green screen. And on the green screen you can put lots of things in the background, photos, or he has airplanes flying by, all sorts of things. So we do a lot of interviews in White House because it adds some professionalism. But yes, we are doing this and seemingly forever, and we hope that the Blade, which has been very kind to us, will continue to be kind to us with articles, because that really gets the phone ringing.
Can you tell us at all about the one you just did yesterday? I'm interested now to find out what that individual story might be.
His name was Mr. Farkas. He went to Korea after the truce was declared, and he spent his time along the demilitarized zone. He didn't get into combat, but getting into combat is not a requirement of our interviews. Mm-hmm. Serving your country is a requirement. So he spent 2 years in the service, a year in Korea. He spent 2 years in active reserves, and then 2 years in the inactive reserves. So he spent 6 years in total serving his country.
I'm glad you mentioned that he didn't see combat but was still worthy of being included in your project, because alluding to what we talked about earlier, you didn't have to be in combat. In your view, did everyone who served become a hero?
I'm not sure how to answer that question. Yeah, you became a patriot.
That's probably the better word.
Yeah.
Yeah. You did what was asked of you.
Yes.
You might have not put yourself in harm's way, but you did it patriotically, and some would say heroically.
But you didn't know when you went in whether you would be in harm's way. There was no way to tell.
See, to me, that's a hero.
Yes. Yeah.
You were willing to, if that's what's required, I'll do it.
Yes. I didn't want to leave home. I didn't want to go, but when I went, I was going to do what I was told to do.
I was in the Army during the Vietnam War, and I never felt what young soldiers in World War II felt. They knew the country had their back.
Yes, yes.
I didn't feel that way. I never went to Vietnam, and I never served in combat, but I was in the military during that difficult time. So I can understand. I didn't feel like a hero at all. Mm-hmm. I did, like you in Austria, I did nothing. Mm-hmm. So I can understand why some of them were a little reluctant to be included.
But to the credit of the American people, we have worked very hard since to make up for that attitude. Today, we honor and revere our military people. Yeah. And I think we're probably trying to make up for the terrible treatment they got.
Speaking of the Vietnam, yeah. Many times, and you've been in these situations where it might be at a band concert, and they play that Armed Forces medley, and everybody's expected to stand when they hear their service hymn. Yes. And I always feel a little bit of guilt getting up when they play the Army song.
Yeah.
Because I think I didn't do anything.
Yeah,
and somebody will tap me on the shoulder and say, "Thank you for your service." And, okay, you're welcome. But
I share that with you.
Yeah. Are there other, so we talked about, do you still have any idea how many vets are still out there? And maybe through our conversation, we'll be inspired to get in touch with you. Any idea how many are left in our immediate area that you haven't talked to?
No idea, but there are still World War II veterans who need a push. And as I said earlier, every time the Blade puts something in about the program, the phone rings. And the Korean War veterans are willing to participate, and now the Vietnam veterans are finally coming around. Maybe they're feeling their mortality or whatever, I don't know, but for the first 10 years of this program, maybe longer, we couldn't talk to a Vietnam veteran. There was bitterness.
Well, let's see what we can do. Find somebody who works at the Blade maybe and would have some influence. I don't know how we can make that happen, but we'll look into that.
Well, that'd be wonderful because our participants respond to the Blade, and the Blade's been very kind to us, to our program.
I'm glad to hear that they appreciate the printed newspaper.
Yes.
A lot of our younger compatriots do not.
Yeah.
Now, you are what, 86 years old yourself? 87?
Well, yeah, I'll be 87 in January. Yeah.
Wow. Well, good for you. You're looking marvelous health and vigor. And you served, as you mentioned, during the Korean War, although not in combat. And do you suspect that most of your interviews from this point on will be Korean vets because we have a few more of them left?
Yes, yes. Uh-huh. And as time passes, the Vietnam veterans will start to feel more comfortable with sharing.
Is there an ongoing project for the Vietnam group?
Oh no, this is the Veterans History Project, covers everybody.
Oh.
Yeah.
So if a Vietnam veteran were to come forward, he could be interviewed
yes.
by you. And
yes.
What would happen to his story at this point if, in the absence of a book?
Well, it would go to the Library of Congress and the University of Toledo, and to his family. I haven't considered at all a book about Vietnam veterans because up until recently, there was not a lot of interest. There was negativity, and I wouldn't think you'd want to produce a book of negative attitudes, but that I think will change, and we will get a better outlook.
Yeah. Did your own military experience serving during the Korean War help you conduct these interviews? Were there things that you knew from your own experience?
Yes, and I have quite an interest in history, and I spent a lot of time in Europe during the service and after. I went back to Europe many times. And so I know a bit about particularly the wars in Europe, some about the wars in the Pacific. But when they find out that I know something about the service and I can talk about basic training or I can talk about troop ships and that sort of thing, then they feel relaxed. They're talking to one of their own. Yeah. And I'm usually older than anybody I talk to anyway.
So you bring instant credibility. I know you have ties with veterans organizations like VFW, American Legion, DAV, and so forth. But their ranks are dwindling too as older veterans die and younger veterans choose not to join. Do you worry that these organizations' days are numbered?
Yeah, I think what will happen is that some of the posts will close and they'll wind up, I would maybe guess at Con Weisenberger, which seems to have some life, and the Korean War veterans will outnumber, of course, the World War II veterans. But I think that there will be some other organizations, like there is the Korean War Veterans Association, and they seem to be alive. Mm-hmm. So yes, the idea of the military organizations is not doing well, but trying very hard.
Yeah. We haven't talked much about your life, and I want to do that before we conclude. You were born, I think, in Detroit
Yes.
in 1931.
Yes.
And, of course, during the Depression, you were just a toddler when the banks crashed and all that stuff. But what are your memories of Detroit in the 1930s and 40s?
A wonderful town. It was a wonderful town for a kid to grow up in. We lived on the east side, a very blue-collar area. Of course, Detroit was a blue-collar town. We lived not far from the Detroit River, where I learned to swim. I could walk down the street and get on a streetcar and go downtown and go to J.L. Hudson's, where I couldn't afford to buy anything, but I could afford to look around at that beautiful store.
Yeah. How about the Tigers? Nevin Field, Briggs Stadium.
Yeah. Well, I was after Navin Field, but I was in the Briggs Stadium years. Yes.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of spirit for the Detroit Tigers.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
And Detroit was a wonderful place because we could go anywhere and do anything for 10 cents, and the streets were safe. We could be out as we got older. We could walk down the streets in the dark, and it was a wonderful town.
And you were totally safe.
Yes. Oh yeah.
Yeah. You were a little too young, obviously, to serve in World War II, but I'm sure you remember December 7th,
Yes.
1941. Can you recall your memories of that day?
Well, we had a radio, a round top radio, and we sat in the front of the radio, and whenever the radio played, of course, you looked at it. There was nothing to see, but you always sat there and looked at the radio. And we remembered, and I think it was the next day, December 8th, that we would hear Roosevelt speak about December the 7th, a day that would live in infamy. Mm-hmm. And I think that everybody in Detroit was listening to that same program. Yeah. And I remember that we lived during the Depression, of course, but then all the plants on the east side, and we had all these automobile plants on the east side, they began to do war work. They became war plants. Mm-hmm. And Detroit, during those years, never slept. Detroit was a 24-hour town. Yeah. And the workers, we had a lot of automobile workers in our neighborhood, they worked 3 shifts. There were 3 shifts, 3 8-hour shifts. So the restaurants, the bars, the coffee shops never closed. The buses ran, and the lights never went out in the plants. And it was like that for the war.
Yeah, I'm sure a lot of folks here in Toledo remember the same of this city.
Yes.
With the production of Jeeps for the military and so forth. You went to high school at Detroit Eastern High School?
Yes, Eastern High School, yes.
Was that a good experience for you?
No, it wasn't. I was a terrible student, just terrible.
About as bad as you were at golf?
Yes. Yeah. I could have been on the golf team at Eastern High School. Yes, I was a terrible student. And I thought it's because I was so dumb, but when I left Eastern High School, I had taken all college preparatory courses, but I wasn't ready for college. So I thought I'll wait a few years and grow up a bit. But by the time I waited a few years, I was in the U.S. Army. So college then was put off till much later.
Yeah. Oh, so you did go to college many years later. Where was that?
University of Toledo.
Yeah. Okay. Now, professionally, your career was in the heating and cooling business?
Yes. Right? I was a wholesale distributor for York International Corporation for Northwest Ohio and northeastern Indiana and southeastern Michigan.
Okay.
And I worked at that for 26 years.
Now, did you juggle the oral history project with those professional responsibilities, or did this come later?
Oh no, when I retired, as I said, I was going to become a full-time golfer. When that didn't work, I thought I have to do something more positive. And so the Toledo Blade had an article about Dr. Tom Barden being appointed the coordinator of the Veterans History Project. And I thought, that's something I could do. That's something positive. That's something I could do to make up for what I didn't do when my country called me. And so in 2002, I started working for the Veterans History Project.
Okay. Yeah. Can you tell us about your family? I believe you lost your wife, Nancy, is it?
Yes. 7 years ago.
2010.
Yes.
Did you have children you could tell us
Well,
about?
yes, I have 3 children, and they were grown. They're all grown, married, and I decided that when we lost her that the only way to survive is to stay busy. So I've been busy ever since.
Yeah.
And
they say when you stop being busy,
yes,
you just don't want to do that. You want to keep doing what you're doing.
I've had, in any given week, I have Saturday off. But the rest of the time, I'm doing something.
You do 1 or 2 of these interviews a week now, or?
It depends on how often they come. In the beginning, it was like every day. It was a full-time job.
Yeah.
I was in the master's program at the university, and I had to give that up because I thought it was more important to do the interviews than to finish the master's program. So then I postponed that for quite a while.
Yeah. I know you're a big believer in volunteerism, too. I read that about you.
Oh, yeah. So I do some lecturing. Well, I don't know if that's the right word. I do some speaking at Lourdes University.
Okay.
And I visit organizations, American Legion downtown, and I have no idea how many talks I've given, 40, 50, something like that.
I got to ask, how'd you get the nickname Bud?
My sister couldn't say Andrew. And so I became...
Just that simple, huh?
Yeah, it was that easy, right? Yes.
Okay.
I'd like to recognize the fact that in this Veterans History Project, I've worked with other people, a man named Longenecker, a name familiar in Toledo. He was in World War II, and he was there in D-Day. And he, at a very old age, very advanced age, he became an interviewer for the Veterans History Project. Huh. Of course, the time has created a problem for that. I work with Richard Baranowski at the Way Public Library in Perrysburg, and he has a book coming out called Now Hear This, and it's a book about Perrysburg veterans. And so he has been very instrumental in keeping the memories alive in Perrysburg. And a few years ago, I became associated with George Pugh, who does the videography. Mm-hmm. Prior to that, we were doing oral interviews, and now we're doing DVDs, which are wonderful. So
you've gone high tech, Bud.
Yes, yes. So I thought if you don't mind,
absolutely, that's fine.
I
should
would recognize those people who contributed, and of course, the Kennedy Center needs to be commended for keeping our 800 interviews. Yeah. And
now people can go to the Kennedy Center and view them?
Yes, with a phone call ahead of time would get the interview out of the safekeeping area to a table where they can be read. And anybody can do that, and the students do it, historians do it.
Great.
With 800 interviews, there's a lot of information.
800 and counting.
And counting, right?
All right.
Yes. Yes.
Thank you so much for sharing your time, the gift of your time today, and for saluting all those who've served in our armed forces. I think Tom Brokaw was right. They truly were our greatest generation. So thanks again for your time today. And of course, we thank you for your continuing interest in the Sight and Sound Video History Series of the Toledo Lucas County Public Library. Remember, keep reading and keep learning.